Good morning, everybody. Great to see you all again today on 4th of July, which is important, for the Americans among us, but also for the Brits among us, for reasons we won't go into. But it's my great honour to present our speaker for today, Professor Dominic Lieven, who's been with the symposium for a few years.
Well, I was sort of virtual reality for the first 3 years because of the wretched pandemic. I sort of loomed up from my house in Japan, peering into the camera.
We're very lucky to have him in person with us. Professor Dominic Lieven graduated first in Cambridge University's class of 1973 with BA in History and was a Kennedy Scholar at Harvard in 1973-1974. And subsequently, he's been a Humboldt Fellow in Germany and a visiting professor at Tokyo University and Harvard. He received his PhD from the School of Slavonic Studies at University College London in 1978. Now, Professor Lieven was a lecturer, senior lecturer and professor at the London School of Economics, LSE, from 1978 to 2011. Became Fellow of the British Academy in 2001, and he was Head of the Department of Government from 2001 to 2004, and Head of the Department of International History from 2009 to 2011. From there, he was Senior Research Fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, 2011 to 2019, and has been an honorary fellow since 2019. He's also awarded the Order of Friendship by the Russian Federation in 2014. And he's currently a visiting professor at the Department of International History at LSE, and is also the chair of the Paulson program at LSE, hosted by the Department of International History at LSE. And I hope all of this is correct. But
it's amazing to hear one's life summed up in just 1 minute.
And of course, author of multiple seminal works, of which we are all very familiar with. And we're treated today to Professor Lieven talking about Russian history. So without further ado, I will hand the floor over to you, Professor Lieven.
Thank you so much. You can actually trace my career through our dogs. My present dog, or my son's, is called Emperor Akbar, or Akbar. And it previously was Barclay de Tolly. That's my shift from Russian to imperial history. Anyway, I try not to lower the tone. Look, I'm very absent-minded anyway, so I will forget your names every day and ask you who you were and when I last met you. But I'm very glad to see you anyway, and God willing, we'll get to know each other. All right, I will not talk under any circumstances for more than 50 minutes today, but I regard today's talk and tomorrow's talk as essentially two parts of the same. So, it doesn't matter if I break off slightly earlier or slightly later today than I'd expected, but I want to give you some opportunity for questions. But, last breathless comment, if you don't get your question in today, well, you can grab me at the lift or something, but also you will have opportunities tomorrow. Okay, fine, I shall start. I think the point to make is that by the standards of empire, the Russian Empire was a great and somewhat unexpected success. Here you had a polity which started off as a sort of tiny principality off the remotest end of the remotest bit of Europe, which, in time became the ruler over whatever it is, a sixth, I think it is, of the world land surface, but was a major ornament of world history, not only in terms of hard power, but also of soft power. If you think of Russian music, literary culture, etc., 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 in the 19th century. So, that is an achievement, and all the more so when you think of the challenges faced by any polity which tried to set itself up in that part of the world. I do not think that there is any other great empire, except for the slightly different examples of the nomadic empires, which started off and indeed had its core, its heartland, so very remote from the great centres of world commerce and world culture. And that has implications. Commerce and culture, if you're a long way away, you tend to have rather small and few towns, small educated sectors of society, etc., etc., etc. Shortage of educated cadres, shortage of the kind of skills and culture that you get in towns was, for a very long time, a challenge for those who created this empire. Here you are stuck way off in a remote region, and then you have to remember that you have no ability, as many of the great empires did, to tap the major international trade routes. If you can't tap the international trade routes for your taxes, you've got no alternative but to squeeze the resources on which, you know, an imperial monarchy and its armed forces are based from the local peasantry. Okay, therefore, Russia comes into the category of what is usually called agrarian empires. In other words, empires which are land-based, which derive most of their fiscal resources and their other resources from squeezing some version of a landholding or land-working peasantry. Again, splendid, and this does include most of the world's greatest empires. But most of the great empires of antiquity, and indeed down to the pre-modern era of Eurasia, are founded around great fertile river valleys with dense and therefore easily taxed populations. You know, the whole history of empire begins with the Tigris and the Euphrates, then you've got the Nile, Yellow River in China, etc., etc. The point about Russia is that not merely is it very far away from the great trade routes, it is also, you know, its homeland, its heartland, is a relatively poor agricultural soil, and far from being concentrated densely in river valleys, very fertile river valleys, the population is scattered across an enormous area. So you have dramatic problems of actually trying to control, tax, exploit these people. The basic point is rather a simple one. You know, that you could simply say that the combination of distance and climate puts an immense value-added tax on every transaction, whether you're talking of government transactions or economic transactions. It's also the case, though, you've got to be a bit careful about Russian self-pity on this issue, that you are in what is geopolitically a difficult spot. You know, for about 1,500, 2,000 years before 1500 our era, the basic point is that nomadic polities are usually, in military terms, more powerful than the sedentary civilizations who are their neighbors. It's not universally true, but it's usually true. Well, Russia is perched right on the edge of the great homeland of the steppe nomad. In other words, that vast plain which stretches from Hungary to Manchuria, Mongolia. And when, after 1500, the balance of power between nomads and sedentary societies begins to shift, Russia then finds itself in the new early modern era on the borderlands of the most aggressive, expansive, and powerful region of the world, Latin Europe. So, you know, again, there are, you know, you have to take all national self-pity, let alone Russian national self-pity, with a pinch of salt. But God didn't give them the easiest spot from which to create a great empire. That said, it isn't all disadvantages. There have always traditionally been advantages of being on the periphery of great civilizations. In the specific periphery that the Russians were sitting in, once they're, you know, coming into the European system of great powers, they have the advantage of strategic depth, which is a pompous way of saying it takes an awful lot to get a European army, infantry, artillery army, and later even panzer army, all the way to Moscow. Strategic depth. That is why Russian governments traditionally got away with making rather more mistakes at the beginning of wars than most of us could get away with. Much more important is the fact that actually, when the Mongol Empire collapsed, a vast geopolitical void opens up to Russia's east. Russia doesn't really have a serious rival or threat out there until they bump into the Japanese at the end of the 19th century. Now, that statement will bring out hysterics in some of my colleagues who are experts on Russian Asia and perfectly fairly talk about the standoff with the Qing towards the end of the 17th century. Frankly, it's small beer. It's about 40 Cossacks shouting boo at 100 Manchu, It's not serious. When you look at the treasure trove involved, it's quite considerable. That's where the furs come from, which mattered so much to early, or sort of what I think of as early modern Muscovy. It's where the gold and silver comes from. It's, of course, the Urals, which for the 18th century and for the first half of the 19th century, and then again, of course, in the 20th century, is the center of Russian heavy industry, including military industry. All of that is conquered very easily, actually, and is an enormous benefit to Russian military geopolitical power. When I talk about the Ottoman Empire later, I will make the comparison that, after all, when the Mongol Empire collapsed to the Ottomans east, far from a huge geopolitical void opening up, they got the Safavids, who were both a very major geopolitical but also ideological challenge and threat to the Ottoman Empire. So, as I say, the Russians don't lose out in every way. Still, you do have to explain, and this is my second major point, how it was that the Russians defeated the challenge and made a success of empire building. And when you're looking at the great Eurasian land empires, you can pretty much generalize about the factors which go into state building. It's monarchies which are sufficiently powerful to keep the elites in some kind of check and order. It's then those elites themselves and the nature of their alliance with the monarchies. It's the institutions of spiritual power as well, and of course it's the peasantry. And imperial Russia succeeds because it actually manages its own rather effective and successful, though extremely ruthless, model of managing those particular institutions and relationships. Start with the monarchy. This is, a pretty formidable monarchy. To talk of it as an absolute monarchy, in one sense, is complete nonsense. No absolute monarchy rules over a vast area with pre-modern communications. Of course, the monarchy is dependent on alliances with elites, etc., etc. Nevertheless, it is a pretty formidable institution in terms of the powers that are reserved to a monarch. What you have is essentially the Byzantine imperial tradition inherited in terms of the church's legitimation of an all-powerful, in principle, absolute monarch. But you shed the Roman Republican elements which do live on into Byzantium. In other words, you do not have the influence of the street in Istanbul, Constantinople, nor do you get military coups in Russia. I'll talk about that a bit later. What I mean by military coups is not just palace coups, which put one member of the dynasty on in place of another. You do get them in 18th century Russia. What you do not get is an army overthrowing the ruler and its successful general becoming emperor in his place. That was a great weakness of imperial Rome, and it was a significant weakness in Byzantium as well, the constant risk of military coups and civil war. Above all, you don't get it in Russia because you have the strength of the dynastic principle. And although that may seem pretty weird to a modern mind, dynastic legitimacy, dynastic right, is a very, very important factor in the consolidation of imperial monarchy. It's the weakness of dynastic right in Rome, for instance, and its semi-weakness in Byzantium, which explains a lot of the failings of the system. At the other end of the spectrum, you have European monarchy, which by most standards, dynasty is far more deeply legitimized in the European system than it is in most of the other systems of Eurasia. I'll talk about this later. I can go on about this forever, but I won't too much. It is in part also what the political scientists call negative legitimation. This strengthens the Russians enormously. In the first place, that means a time of troubles. One of the absolute pillars of the Romanov autocracy is the memory constantly regurgitated in the monarchy's propaganda. That when the old dynasty died out, you had pretenders, you had foreign invasion, you had mayhem, and that it is the recreation in the dynasty of the Romanovs of the old model of autocratic monarchy, which has enabled Russia to recover from foreign invasion, regain all its territories, and then expand at the expense of its neighbors. And of course, Romanov propagandists, and indeed more broadly, the Russian elite of that time, enjoyed itself enormously in the 18th century, pointing out the contrast to Sweden once it had gone over to constitutional monarchy, above all, of course, to Poland, but also to the weakness of the Ottoman monarchy in the face of its elites in the era which is sometimes called the Second Ottoman Empire. the argument drummed in time and time again is that the powerful autocratic monarchy of Russia enables this country to thrive. Constitutional government, which usually means some form of elite privilege, results in division, disintegration, and foreign conquest, etc., etc., etc. Right. I mean, the key alliance in Russia, as indeed in all these great Eurasian empires, is with some version of landowning elite, or land-owning, land-holding. You know, there are variations on this theme. And that for the absolute obvious reason that if you're trying to govern vast areas with pre-modern communications, you absolutely have to have a stable compromise between the central authority, the monarchy, and some version of provincial elite. This is politely described, particularly by some political scientists, as agreement to how to share out the peasant surplus. I think most peasantries weren't too aware that they had a great surplus and would rather have kept it for themselves. But I mean, the point is true. You do what you can in terms of, gathering the furs and mining the silver, etc. But basically, your revenues depend on squeezing peasants. And the key is to have a stable compromise between the monarchy and what you might describe as some version of hereditary aristocratic elite, a stable compromise to divide up the spoils. The threat usually being to these great Eurasian empires that in time, distance, succession troubles, all sorts of things result in the weakening of the central authority and the local elites just taking more and more of the surplus for themselves. At which point you get an unraveling. You see this time and time again with the Byzantines, with the Ottomans, with Chinese dynasties, etc. You don't see it in Russia. And that is a very important reason for the success of the Russian imperial polity. If you're looking at the Russian old elites, in other words, the aristocratic hereditary ruling class, if you want. Ruling class is the wrong word in many ways. If you're trying to put them in Eurasian perspective, comparative perspective, I think it is fair to say that they are always closer to Latin Europe than they are to anything else in Eurasia. That is obviously the case once you get cultural westernization beginning the 17th century, taking off under Peter and subsequently. But even in structural terms, I think it's also true. Very obviously, the old Russian hereditary landowning warrior class is a very long way from the Ottoman slave bureaucrats of the Sultan's household, who are the core of the ruling elite in the real heyday of the Ottoman Empire. You're, if anything, even further away from Confucian and Neo-Confucian Chinese bureaucratic elites. You're closer to, let us say, the Manchu, the Qing, elite, or at least the Manchu side of it. There's, of course, an alliance with the Chinese bureaucracy. You're closer to the Mughal elite. But in both cases, unlike in Russia, you are dealing there with largely conquest elites, ones which are much less deeply rooted, much less historically rooted in the local geography and population, and also ones which actually have less security of hereditary tenure and wealth than the Russian elites have. Now, this all may seem very strange to you because from the most historiographical perspective, the Russians are always compared with the Europeans, and it's their differences, therefore, which come out. If you put it in Eurasian perspective, it's the other way around. They're closer to Latin Europe. It is, of course, true, and is a point which has been made endlessly ever since Russia came into the European imagination, that the Russian, if you want to call them aristocracy, does not have the same feudal origins, or at least sheds those that it had, doesn't play the same role in creating institutions, laws, conventions that constrain the monarchy in the way that the English, French, German, Italian aristocracies did. And that's true. But as I say, you need to say at least two or three things. Firstly, repeating the point, that is in a sense a narrow Eurocentric view, taking the whole of Eurasia and the Russians are closer to the Europeans. Secondly, it's in many ways a silly view, at least as applied to pre-18th century. The Russians only began to compare themselves or look at themselves from a European Latin perspective from the 18th century. So in a way, in saying that, they failed to do, and this was the traditional stress, what the Europeans did in creating the basis for modern constitutionalism and ultimate democracy, is to ascribe to them a task which never occurred to them, You've also got to remember that if the Russian elites, the old Russian aristocracy, had sat in their homeland and busily tried to constrain the monarchy and divide up their estates, no one would have heard of them. They'd have gone bankrupt about 600 years ago, etc., etc. What they actually did by combining with the autocratic monarchy in a very effective system for, smash and grab, Al Capone on a sort of imperial geopolitical basis, was to take over half the world and actually divide it up very cosily among themselves. This was an exceptionally successful system for expansion, and it was an exceptionally successful system for keeping going the elites themselves. Not least, of course, and this becomes very important, because apart from the income from their estates, which if you divide up between all the sons is always diminishing, the Russian elites derived tremendous benefits from service to the crown, from military service, from service in the civil bureaucracy, etc. At the core of this aristocratic monarchical alliance are the armed forces and to some extent the state bureaucracy of the monarchy. They provide the elites with income, they provide them with security against peasant insurrection, and at the same time, the elites themselves, by serving in these institutions, allow the monarchy to function. So it's a very crafty setup. Paul I, bumped off actually by my great-great-great-grandfather in 1801, the last successful military coup in Russian history. He once called the noble landowner the state's involuntary tax collector and recruitment agent in the provinces, and that's what they were. And of course, the monarchy could not have survived without them. Remember that in 1763, Russia has just about the same number of state officials as Prussia. Prussia is 1% of the size of Russia in Europe. So even more than in most of these great Eurasian empires, the landowning elite is crucial, and it is very integrated, very tightly integrated into the monarchy. In many ways, Peter's greatest triumph is to turn what was beginning to look like, at least in military terms, a redundant military elite into something which became the very viable and pretty formidable officer corps of the Russian army and navy, and to some extent the core of the bureaucracy as well. And here again you have the European parallels. Again in Europe you have, in the 16th century, the old knightly chivalric warrior, becoming redundant with the emergence of the European military fiscal state, the artillery army, the infantry army, the disciplined cavalry, etc. And Europe and the European monarchies flourish because they do, in most cases, succeed in turning this increasingly redundant knightly warrior elite into the professional but loyal servants of the crown. Russia, again, takes the European model. The Ottoman Empire fails to do that in the 18th century, and I'll talk to you about it, and that goes a huge way to explaining why Russia succeeds as a great power in the 18th century, and frankly, one's not allowed to say it, of course, nowadays, but the Ottomans fail. A point I would just put in parentheses, of course, success is at the price of a very ruthless system of exploitation. I think that much of subsequent Russian history, including the revolution, to some extent derives from just the injustices and the fierceness of this system. On the other hand, the Ottoman failure to create this kind of system results in the genocide and ethnic cleansing of vast numbers of Muslims from the northern borderlands of the empire and European colonization of some of the heartlands of Islam. There are no easy rides, no free breakfasts if you're on the borderlands of Latin Europe in the early modern and modern era. You pay a price for survival, you pay a price for failure. So, you know, the symbol of all of this alliance is really the noble officer of the Tsarist army wearing the Tsar's uniform, wearing the Tsar's insignia on his shoulder bands, but with the gorget, the old, you know, chivalric remnants, and the army officers of European armies down to 1914. It sort of symbolizes the tightness of that alliance. All right, I think, yeah, won't go beyond that except to actually make one final point. For all polities, but above all for great powers and great empires, one of the key challenges is to maintain armed forces of sufficient effectiveness to expand and to defend the state's territories, to compete against other great military powers and systems, while at the same time keeping those armies loyal to the state, loyal to whoever the rulers are. And again, Russia is very much in the European camp here. The ability of Latin Europe and Russia to combine formidable military power with loyalty to the dynasty, to the monarchy, or to the power, you know, to the legitimate authority, is absolutely fundamental to the expansion of Europe. Compare this to Rome, you know, compare this to Byzantium, compare this to many of the Chinese dynasties. I mean, the greatest probably of all the Chinese dynasties. The Tang is essentially brought down by a revolt of its greatest general, An Lushan. They never recover from that. And it is, you know, that rebellion and the decline of the Tang dynasty and then fall is a significant reason why Central Asia, which at that time was up for competition between China and its civilization and the Islamic world, goes to the Islamic world where it has remained to this day. So these things matter. One of the effects of the traumatic An Lushan rebellion on subsequent Chinese history is that the next dynasty, the Sung, and indeed the next Han Chinese dynasty, the Ming, spent a great deal of their time and effort trying to ensure the loyalty of their armies, terrified of various coups d'etats, rebellions and everything. And they do succeed to a certain extent in defending themselves against coups d'etats. They also succeed in undermining their military effectiveness and making themselves more vulnerable to external invasion. The Europeans get the balance right, and so do the Russians. And that is all to do with dynasticism and the alliance between a legitimate hereditary monarchy and a hereditary aristocracy which actually operate on relatively similar principles. Again, I could go into this in more detail subsequently, but I won't say more now. The next thing to talk about very briefly is the church, managing one or other version of spiritual authority is absolutely fundamental to the history of all these great empires I study. Now you've told me I've got lots of time. I shall set off, but I won't, I promise you, in a long disquisition about the importance of the fusion of spiritual and temporal power in the Chinese monarchy. The Chinese emperor as both, you know, chief political officer, but also, you know, not priest is the wrong word, but chief priest, which is in many ways the fusion of spiritual and temporal power in China and its division in Western Europe, Latin Europe, is probably the single most important reason why empire is the prevalent and still remaining form of polity in East Asia and multipolarity in Western Eurasia, in other words, Europe. But anyway, I won't go on about that now. What I will just say about the Russian church is that it is a marvelous ally of the monarchy. The move of the patriarch to Moscow right back in the early modern time is crucial to the rise of the Muscovite state and later of the Russian Empire. The church's support adds vastly to the legitimacy of firstly the Rurikid and then the Romanov regime. Point to remember always about the Russians is that they are surrounded by people of other faith. Latin Christians to the west, Muslims to the south, nomad pagans to the east. They are also very conscious of being the last great legitimate, true Christian polity, after the fall of Byzantium. It does help to explain some of Russian exceptionalism and some of the ways in which the church and its link to the monarchy is such an important factor in legitimacy. The great thing about the church from the monarchy's perspective, though, is that not merely is it an enormous enhancer of the dynasty's legitimacy, it is also increasingly politically weak and controlled by the monarchy to a degree that was not true in Catholic Europe or in many of the Islamic states. Again, I could talk about this for a long time. I won't. I'll just give you one example of why this matters. If you look at Europe, in Catholic Europe, the state usually, or the church usually hangs on to its lands right through to the end of the 18th century, sometimes beyond. In Protestant Europe, the church's lands are expropriated and most of them end up in the hands of some version of aristocracy. In Russia, the state's lands are expropriated. The church's lands are expropriated, but they remain in the hands of the state. That helps to explain why, on the eve of the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, actually just over half the Russian peasantry were not serfs of private landowners. Their entire, in inverted surplus, went either to the state or to the Romanov family. And that is very important. If you ever are interested in the history of Eurasian Empire, and you're feeling in a particularly saintly and self-sacrificial mode, read a book by someone, called Eisenstein, Political Systems of Empires. It is the equivalent of spending a whole week eating nothing but cold tofu. But it's not bad scholarship in its way, and the point he makes endlessly is that a really powerful Eurasian empire, stable, long-lasting empire, requires a big, in inverted commas, free peasantry, by which I mean free, not the private property of aristocratic elites, so that its entire surplus flows to the monarchy. Well, the Russian monarchy is extremely crafty and to some extent extremely lucky. It hangs on to a great many peasants as its own direct dependents and taxpayers. In other words, it takes all the tax and all the services from them, doesn't share it with the aristocratic elite. But there is enough surplus going to the aristocratic elite to sustain the states, taxpayers, army officers, etc., 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 etc. Not a bad balance. As I say, very crafty and very ruthless. Come the mid-19th century, the issue becomes how do you turn a very successful pre-modern imperial polity into a viable modern state? And you've got problems. One of them, as is usually the case, is that those institutions were extremely successful in one era, have the legitimacy and simply the inertia that comes from that success, but now have to be applied in a different era, where the criteria for success may be rather different. That is to some extent true of autocratic absolute monarchy. Though I'll temper that, I'll talk more about that later. It's certainly true of the church. The fact that the church is so closely under the state's thumb helps to explain why, unlike in Catholic Europe, the Orthodox Church is not a very successful institution as regards counter-revolution, etc., political conservatism, whereas the Roman Catholic Church is probably the single most effective institution sustaining conservatism and counter-revolution in the second half of the 19th century and in 20th century Europe. Thirdly, westernization. The westernization of the elites is absolutely essential to Russia's rise to great power status. It does create a cultural gap, which is a source of acute vulnerability by the late 19th and 20th century. And of course, I've already talked about the fact that this very successful pre-modern empire was based on a very ruthless system of exploitation, which comes home to roost. Before you get down to the nitty-gritty of the Romanov regime's failure ultimately to manage the challenges of creating a viable modern polity, it is, I think, worth remembering two broader comparative points. One is what I call the second Europe, the Europe of the periphery, which stretches from Ireland through Iberia down to Italy and out into Eastern Europe. Of course, there is an enormous variety. The difference between Florence and, some Bulgarian village hardly needs to be stressed. The basic point, though, is that there are similarities. You are dealing with a region which, by the standards of what I call the first world, the European heartlands, has much smaller middle classes in 1850, vastly larger peasantries. Private property is less secure, particularly in the countryside. You usually have either actually multi-ethnicity or you have very disparate regions, etc., etc., etc. You also have a state which is more brittle. To sum it up, one of the best books I read on 19th century history is Weber, Peasants into Frenchmen. The French regimes, particularly the Third Republic, does turn peasants into Frenchmen. That includes Breton and Aquitanian peasants who in 1800 spoke a language incomprehensible to anyone in Paris. Italy, which stands at the top of what I call the Second World, never succeeds in turning even urban southern Italians, let alone the Italian peasantry, into its version, the House of Savoy's version, of modern Italian national consciousness. And one could go on forever. Remember that Russia is more or less at the bottom of the second Europe, peripheral Europe, in terms of GDP per head. It's roughly equal to Spain. And remember also that virtually none of the polities of the Second World had a peaceful transition to liberal democracy in the 20th century. Virtually all of them came under one version or another of authoritarian rule. And if they, in the end, mostly came back to liberal democracy, frankly, that had more to do with the victory of the Anglo-American armies in the Second World War than it had to internal processes, in my opinion. The second point is that not merely is Russia towards the bottom of the Second Europe, it's also an empire, one of the 6 or 7 great empires which dominated the world in 1914. It is to the point that none of them have survived. The one that came closest is China, and very obviously it did not survive through liberal democracy or without revolution. If you were looking at the dilemma of Nicholas II by 1914, the domestic dilemma, you could put it roughly like this. In his left ear, he's got the more liberal members of the ruling elite saying to him, look, Your Majesty, we live in the 20th century. 20% of our society you could describe as European. Quite apart from us, we have a very sophisticated upper elite. Do you really think that you're going to be able to legitimately rule these people through what is essentially a system of 18th century enlightened despotism, but is justified by even earlier ideas or legitimized of absolute monarchy? No, you're not. Unless you give people the civil and then political rights which they take for granted as Europeans, as the inevitable path to modernity, you're going to completely delegitimize your regime and there's going to be a revolution. And they're right. And that is roughly the story that certainly in my early days one was taught in the West. The trouble is, in his other ear, the poor man had the more conservative members of the ruling elite who said to him, fine, Your Majesty, but unfortunately 80% of your population does not come into this category. They do not belong to modern European society, nor do they share values such as the absolute sanctity of private property, etc., etc., etc. We face the possibility of a peasant revolution for all sorts of reasons, some of them rooted in the collectivist instincts of the population, some just part of the travails of modernization in early capitalism. We face the most radical working class in Europe, partly for the same reasons that the traditional collectivist memories and values of the peasantry, but also because of the failures of Tsarist labor policy to some extent. Remember too that only 44% of your subjects are Great Russians. Remember also that we already have had now for 2-3 generations a socialist revolutionary movement which is committed to the destruction not just of the monarchy but of all the institutions of private property and European society in Russia. If you liberalize, let alone democratize, at least before you have created a big conservative peasant landowning class, everything is going to collapse. There is no halfway at the moment. No liberal constitutionalist bourgeois regime has any chance of surviving without the carapace of the police state and the monarchy, which at the moment protect it. And it was difficult. You know, there was not much room for manoeuvre. Solutions to one set of challenges very often worsened others. They might have got through. They might have got through without the war. Personally, I think if they had done so, or indeed if the Whites had won the Civil War, the likeliest scenario would have been some version of military dictatorship, probably with the monarchy as a legitimizing element above it, probably taking on some elements of Italian fascism, because the corporate state designed by Mussolini had some similarities with conservative thinking in Russia before 1914. It wouldn't have been pleasant, and certainly it would have been far nastier than Italian fascism when it came to the fate of the Jews. But they might have survived. The war was in that sense crucial. And the international context always was for Imperial Russia, and actually still is for all of us. And one can sum up the dilemma terribly simply. And it was a dilemma which lasted from 1905 to 1945. Faced with the possibility of German hegemony in Europe, you had two alternatives. Either you ganged up with the other peripheral powers, the French and the British, to deter and, if necessary, defeat Germany, or you attempted to steer Germany westwards into a struggle with the French and the British, which might last a generation, during which you yourself would be able to consolidate the polity, grow your economy, and emerge as undoubtedly the most powerful state in Eurasia, in northern Eurasia. And the basic point is that Nicholas II and his government took the policy of deterrence before 1914, and it failed, despite the fact that, of course, there were opponents who were arguing for deflection. I'll talk about them tomorrow. The most famous and probably the most intelligent was a man called Pyotr Donovo. Stalin, faced with the same problem, took the other policy in 1939, deflection. In other words, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, in the hope that the French and the British and the Germans would fight a renewed First World War, etc., etc., and Russia would emerge. Soviet Russia would stay out of it and emerge far more powerful as a result. The basic point is that the Russian policy of deterrence failed in 1914, and Stalin's policy of deflection failed in 1941. That's not to say that necessarily either were wrong or stupid in taking the line they did. I think deterrence might well have worked in 1914 if the British had been truly committed to it, if the British strategy had been convincing and unequivocal. But that would have required a defensive alliance with France, a military commitment to Belgium, conscription, etc., which was unimaginable in pre-war Britain. You've got to be careful in terms of history of the First World War, saying, oh, this shows all the awful stupidity of autocracy. Of course it did to some extent, but the British also messed it up because of the nature of British tradition, British institutions, and the mentalities of the British people. And then the last thing I say, this really is the last thing, is that yes, Stalin messed it up in 1939, but it wasn't just Stalin who expected the Second World War to be the first and was utterly astonished and appalled by the Germans knocking out France in 6 weeks for 60,000 dead. It astonished not just the French and British, of course, but also most German generals, which explains why much of Germany thought Hitler was a genius until things, as you might say, went a bit long in Russia. And there I will stop. I will finish off the rest of what I was going to say, mix it in with my talk tomorrow, and I will, ask me questions now, but don't despair if you've got questions bottled up, because I'm going to come at this from a different angle tomorrow and also carry it through for the rest of the 20th century. Good.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
I'm Hilary. I study Soviet and African history and spend a lot of time thinking about comparative empire and decolonization. And I've been reflecting throughout your talk on a lot of different possible meanings of empire.
Yeah.
We spoke about it a couple of days ago as a mode of governance characterized by differentiation and some form of hierarchy.
Sure.
There's the kind of popular understanding of empire as a political system that is bad, unjust.
Sure. Sure.
And something different that seems to come out of your presentation about projecting power across space and time. And so maybe the way I want to pose my question is quite cheeky, which is quoting you back to you. You started by saying the Russian Empire was a great and surprising success. Curious how you understand.
Go.
Yes. Curious how you understand empire and greatness.
Sure. Well, I mean, firstly, I've done a lecture on empire, which is somewhere out there. So, you know, you get more of this from that, and we'll have a special discussion session. Secondly, I will talk a bit about this tomorrow. My basic definition of empire is firstly enormous space. That was always a huge problem for empire, less so once modern communications shrink space, but still a big issue. Second, multi-ethnicity. That was less of a problem for traditional empire, becomes more of a problem in the modern era with the politicization of ethnicity. But above all, for me, empire is power. Unless you are a power of sufficient scale to dominate the international relations of an era, I don't think you're worth calling an empire. Of course, if you've done it in the past, you can be the sort of, you know, the Ottomans were a sort of empire down to 14. But of course, power is not just hard power. In fact, in the long run, soft power probably matters more. My great comparison there is the early caliphate and the Mongol Empire. In military terms, both depend on the power of nomadism. But the steppe lands of northern Eurasia, from which the Mongols come, are much more fertile for military power than the Arabian desert for all sorts of, don't get me talking about infantry tactics and the early caliphate, but, on the other hand, in the long run, of course, the fact that the early caliphate is, I think, the essential basis for the survival and expansion of Islam in those first 2 centuries when it was very vulnerable, first perhaps 3 centuries. And that it was the Abbasids in particular who therefore have enabled Islam to jump to be one of the great world, not just religious but cultural realities. They're far more important than the Mongols, despite what you get some of these people who wrote about Mongol history saying. It's obvious. So those would be my 3 definitions. But, I came into this from a different angle. I jumped into empire, and I'll explain this tomorrow, looking at the crisis of the Soviet Union. And when I did that, I was already thinking in these sort of Mongol, earlier Islamic Caliphate terms. But it was clear to me that Gorbachev was actually trying to shift the foundations of what I thought of as a sort of neo-empire in the Soviet Union, so that it would become a democratic, legitimate federation. Had he succeeded in doing that, the Soviet Union would still have been very powerful, very multi-ethnic, and very big. But it would have been a significantly different sort of polity. It mattered enormously, in other words, that he was trying to achieve that shift and he failed. So that taught me that I do not think you can have any definition of empire which is valid across the whole of history. Because, of course, when I had my 4th pillar, which was without the explicit consent of the governed, that was a very important definition for me to try and understand, the crisis of the Soviet Union. But it was a completely ridiculous one when you applied it to most of history, where virtually no polities ruled on the basis of the explicit consent of the governed, which didn't necessarily mean they weren't legitimate in the eyes of their contemporaries. So I take it for empire that there is no one definition. It's bloody stupid to argue about whether a polity was or wasn't an empire, because that all depends on definitions, which are usually rooted in your own ideological commitments, and also in terms of what you're trying to do. The interesting question is to ask whether thinking of this polity, in that case the Soviet Union, as an empire, helps you to see things in different ways, spot things you wouldn't have spotted, etc., etc. And I think it was. and never more so than in terms of the screaming dangers, which the end of empire brings up. To be perfectly honest, although what is happening right now is appalling, it surprises me less that it's happening now than it didn't happen 30 years ago. The end of empire is usually a source of international and civil war and universal mayhem. So that's how I would put it, But as I say, we'll probably go on talking about this all the way through, my talks, because it sort of runs in and out. And as I say, I think the great thing is to be a bit modest and above all not to turn these ridiculous definitions into religion. They exist to be helpful, not to give people a sense of security and identity and the great scholars in the great scheme of things,
My name is Jonathan. I'm a PhD student of Soviet history at Princeton University. I have two very brief questions. One is, I want to hear your thoughts on how the Imperial Russian conquest of Central Asia changed the trajectory of the Russian Empire and then of the Soviet Union. There's the obvious argument that this is, Central Asia is actually what turned Russia and all the more the Soviet Union into a multinational state, particularly in the self-perception of the elites. And then, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. And then the second question is about soft power, which you were just talking about. Imperial Russia, you mentioned that obviously had significant soft power, the Soviet Union arguably even more so. And I'm just wondering about Russia today, what you think about this. Russia can obviously challenge the United States in hard power terms, but I'm wondering to what extent this is still true in soft power.
Sure. Again, I'll try and answer briefly, but these issues will keep coming back and back and back. What I think the conquest of Central Asia did for the imperial Russian elites was to consolidate their sense that they were part of a European civilizing mission and that they were very much part of the expansion of Europe and one of the, very small group of European imperial powers which would determine the future of mankind, this kind of stuff. I think you'd be pushing things to say that it's only with the conquest of Central Asia that they think of themselves as a multinational empire. They're well aware of that before. Nor is it even true that the conquest of Central Asia is the first time that they really feel that they are in full scale, superior European culture bringing its benefits to benighted Asiatics. I mean, they had some of this sense in the Caucasus surely, particularly in the Islamic areas. I think they had much of that sense in the Tatar areas. And it's ever since Peter that the idea of Russia as part of a European civilizing mission is very evident, for instance, in their attitudes towards the Ottoman Empire, which shift not just because of growing Russian power, but because the Russians ascribe, or the Russian elites ascribe their growing power precisely to the fact that Peter has taken on European principles, institutions, you name it. So that would be my initial answer to that. As for soft power, at least for a time, the Soviet Union enjoyed a degree of soft power which Imperial Russia didn't have, and post-Soviet Russia certainly doesn't have. I think initially you do. I do think of it in terms of the early caliphate in many ways. The whole idea is that you were creating an alternative, superior socialist version of modernity. And for a generation, it's powerful. And then with the victory in the Second World War and the rise of the Soviet Union to be a superpower, it shifts somewhat. I've got people here who know more about this than I do, but it clearly does shift somewhat, but not entirely, by any manner of means. Imperial Russia is an interesting one. I'm not a post-colonial historian, though I get some good things out of it. But Russia does stand on both sides of that debate, very obviously. In one sense, it is on the periphery of the world headquarters of what you might describe as modernity, the rational scientific worldview. And unlike even in Spain or Portugal, which you might describe as also on the periphery, you're jumping across a civilization, or at least semi-across a civilization, the big divide between orthodoxy and Latin Christendom. But on the other hand, of course, Russia is a great power, and certainly the Russians are, to some extent, on the sort of colonizing side, metropole side, as regards your Central Asians. it gets more complicated, which is why, again, I mean, the last thing you want is turning academic methodologies into issues of, religion, identity, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You've got a ruling class which is itself multinational and at its elite, at its absolute top, is happier in French until the 1850s. And even in the 1890s, the most exclusive set in Petersburg society are called the English-bred lords, because they deliberately speak Russian to the extent they do speak it with an English accent. So this is it's complicated. It's complicated, I'll talk about this tomorrow. I'm a historian, but I spent 31 of my years in a political science department. I was head of the department. I'm a historian who, I'll talk about this as well, became a historian not to understand the present or the future, but because I was completely enthralled and my imagination got loose about the past. But by the standards of most historians, largely by accident, I've spent much more of my time talking to government in the middle of politics. So I'm an odd mixture myself, and so I feel some of these odd mixtures. I think political science can be useful as long as you take it with a pinch of salt.
Thank you so much, and good morning. My name is Kyle Tucker, and I'm an incoming master's student in security studies at King's College London. My question is a little similar to Sophia's and about like the ethnic diversity question. One of the readings that we did for the symposium, I can't recall quite which, but something stood out to me, and that was that the reading said that as the Russian Empire expanded, it, obviously it needed new elites to kind of hold down and control these new areas, and that to a certain extent, some of the conquered peoples were kind of incorporated into the structure of the elite, like the land-owning classes, like in Tatarstan and the Georgians. And I was curious, did that sort of trend or at all change the structure of the empire and the elites? Or do you think it was more of a kind of a trend of assimilation where these peoples tried to model themselves off the original Russian elites as much as possible?
Again, it's complicated. I'm trying to say 6 things at the same time in 1 minute. The basic logic, it seems to me, of the Russian imperial setup carries through from the 17th century to the end. So, taking on these new areas and their elites does not change the fundamental principles of the Russian autocratic system of government. On the other hand, and this is true of all the great Eurasian empires, success does depend very greatly on bringing the elites of conquered areas into the system and into, a single imperial elite. They do that to various degrees with varying amounts of success, but they are mostly successful, with the exception of Poland, I would say. The Polish elites are never really trusted or brought in. Our lot, the Balts, are the most spectacular success. Again, like most empires, because of the nature of the old regime Russian state, which is a monarchical aristocratic setup, but also because of they find it easier to integrate new regions into the empire when those regions themselves are hierarchical societies with elites and hereditary aristocracies. It's simply easier to fit them into the system. You can integrate the elites, give them positions in the system, give them security. They will manage their own people. It's harder when you get more level societies where it's harder to do deals with elites. The Spanish never, well, for a long time, don't conquer much of Chile. You have no-go areas. You have no-go areas in mountain regions. The Russians found, the Chechens very difficult, both because of the terrain and because it was a more even society where they couldn't co-opt elites so easily. They find Ossetians easier. etc., etc., etc. So you have all of that. Then you do also have to remember that the Russian elite itself is increasingly westernized, at which point you get what is by colonial standards, but not necessarily by Eurasian standards, a strange setup whereby the Russian elite sits at the top and increasingly speaking a foreign language, often among themselves, and adopting many aspects of a Western. So, you know, it's a synthesis. It's a synthesis, but the most successful Eurasian empires always were synthesis. And NB, you know, there is a big difference between the cultural arrogance of Western overseas imperialism and a very important strand, perhaps the most important strand in Eurasian imperialism, which is nomads conquering great centers of civilization and actually themselves, to a great extent, being conquered by the civilizations they take over in cultural terms. So there are many, you know, many variations on this theme. But the Russians are quite crafty. The problem comes, and it's what I was talking about today, when you move from the pre-modern into the modern era. Traditional empires, if they're crafty, bring in aristocracies, incorporate them. From the emperor's own position, they can be very useful because they give him a degree of autonomy from the aristocratic networks of his own, in this case, you know, the Russian elite. So it increases his room for maneuver. But, you know, once you move into the modern era, you've got to then try and legitimize yourself and bring in a much broader group. And that is a far more difficult challenge. Perhaps it's an unanswerable challenge. I mean, think of British India. It's very loosely controlled, really. But as long as you can manage it largely by bringing in the old, you know, princely state and upper class elites, it's manageable. You can try to do the same with the new business elites, which come up in the 20th century. Once it begins to go beyond that in terms of mass politics, you're in deep trouble. And in fact, it's unmanageable, fundamentally. And then again, you come back to the dilemma, and it helps to explain Russification. And all the empires are doing it in one way or another. Once it seems that the name of the game in terms of domestic legitimacy is some version of nationalism, then you have a hell of a problem trying to manage the balances of a multi-ethnic empire.
So I think we are running out of time, so I'd just like you to join me in a round of applause for Professor Lieven's wonderful lecture.